The first thing I knew was wrong was the ring talking to itself. I had been on the span for 19 hours, walking the inner gantry of Sector 9 with a torque wrench and a bad knee, when the maintenance channel in my ear stopped reporting flow rates and started reporting contacts. Not a drill. Drills announced themselves with a tone and a countdown. This came in flat, the way the span only ever spoke when something real had crossed a line it watched. 41 bodies, the ring said, decelerating hard out past the lunar shoals. Mass signatures that did not match any registered hull in the ledger. I stopped with my hand on a cooling junction and listened to my own breath go shallow inside the suit. I was 63 years old. I had tended this stretch of the orbital ring for 40 of those years, and in 40 years the worst thing I had ever logged was a micrometeor strike that scarred a radiator fin. The span was 140 kilometers of armored structure hung in a slow circle above the equator, and most of my career had been spent keeping its arteries warm and its valves honest. It was not built to do nothing. I had simply never seen it do the other thing. Voren. The voice belonged to Hale, the watch coordinator 2 sectors down. She did not sound frightened. She sounded careful, which from Hale was worse. You seeing the ledger flags? I'm seeing them. Get to a hard point. Not a suggestion. I went. The gantry ran past a row of viewports the size of barn doors, and through them I could see the curve of the earth below, blue and white and patient under the dawn line, and I could see the cities, not as lights. It was day on the strip beneath us, and the megacities stood up out of the continents like ranges of pale mountains, towers stacked so high their tops caught the sun before the ground below them woke. 200 kilometers off our flank, the defense platform Caldwell Anchor floated in formation with us, a slab of dark metal 4 kilometers across, its weapon arrays folded down flat like a sleeping thing. I had passed it 1,000 times and barely looked. Now I looked. The contacts kept decelerating. The ring narrated their burn in that flat ledger voice, and somewhere in the numbers I caught the shape of the thing. 41 hulls, moving as one body. Not formation keeping the way a human squadron does it. Each ship a separate mind-holding station. This was different. They turned together, braked together, adjusted together, as if a single hand were closing 41 fingers at once. I had heard old men in the dock canteens talk about the Hive. Most of us thought it was a story. 200,000 years is not a number a person can hold in the hand. It is a number you say and then stop, because the saying of it is already too much. 200,000 years ago, before the long quiet, before the cities, before the ring, something had come to this planet and found it soft, and used it the way a man uses a field he does not own. The records that survived were thin and strange. They spoke of a collective that did not bargain because it did not see anything to bargain with. It harvested, it moved on, it expected the field to be there when it circled back. It had circled back. Hail, I said. Tell me the platforms are awake. The platforms have been awake since before you were born, she said. Get to your hard point, Sale. This is going to be a long morning. The hard point for Sector 9 was a reinforced bay where the gantry crew sheltered, and where, if it came to it, an engineer could feed manual commands into the ring's deep systems when the automatics wanted a human hand on them. I sealed the hatch behind me and pulled myself into the cradle and brought the local board up, and the board showed me the thing I had felt in my chest already. The span was changing its breathing. Coolant that had run in lazy maintenance loops for 4 decades was rerouting itself in great slow surges toward the spine, toward the dorsal channels I had inspected 100 times and never once seen carry load. The ring was filling its lungs. I want to be honest about what I felt, because the men who tell these stories later always make themselves braver than they were. I was afraid. Not of dying exactly. I had made a kind of peace with dying a long time ago, the way you do when your work keeps you in vacuum. I was afraid of the gap. The gap between what those 41 ships thought they were coming to and what was actually here, and the certainty that the gap was about to be closed in front of me, with me inside it. The Hive ships crossed the lunar shoals and did not slow further. They came on, sure of themselves, sure of the field. Caldwell Anchor is tracking, Hale said. All platforms tracking. Ground command has the con, we hold. We hold, I repeated, because that was what you said. On the board, the 41 hulls resolved out of the murk of distance into something my eyes could read. They were not sleek. That surprised me, somehow. I had pictured the Hive as something cruel and elegant, all blade and chitin, and instead the ships were swollen, asymmetrical, grown rather than built, pale gray masses pocked with apertures, trailing long fibrous structures that drifted and curled as the ships maneuvered, like roots torn loose from soil. They had no running lights, they had no names I could read. They moved with the awful unanimity of a single organism wearing 41 bodies, and they were beautiful in the way a flood is beautiful, right up until it reaches your door. The lead mass opened a channel. It did not hail us in words. It pushed a pattern across every band at once, a structured pulse that the ring's translators chewed on and rendered into something almost like language, and the something was not a greeting. It was an inventory. The Hive was announcing what it intended to take. It listed the planet beneath us the way a man reads a deed, the seas, the crust, the biomass, the orbital metals, all of it cataloged and claimed in a flat, unhurried cascade, and at the end of the cascade was a single concept the translators could only render as a question that was not really a question. "Where are the caretakers?" it asked. "Who will surrender the field?" I sat in the cradle with my hands flat on the board and felt something move in me. That was older than fear. My grandfather had worked the early scaffolds of this ring when it was still bones and promises. His grandfather had broken rock to lay the first anchor cities. The line of us went back and back, every generation handing the work down, and not one of us had ever known why we built so heavy, why a species that had not seen war in living memory armored its sky like a country expecting a siege. We built it because the ones before us had built it. We tended it because they said tend it, and now, 200,000 years after a thing came and took what it wanted and left, the thing had come home expecting the field, and the field had spent the whole interval becoming a wall. "They're asking who'll surrender," I told Hale, because I could not help saying it out loud. I heard a pause. "Ground Command is composing a reply." "What's the reply?" "Nothing yet. They want the Hive close." Another pause, and when she spoke again, there was something underneath her careful voice that I had not heard from her in 19 years of shifts together. Not fear, the opposite of fear, a kind of held grief. The grief of a person who is prepared for a terrible thing for so long that its arrival feels almost like mourning. They want them all the way in. Sail. Past the shoals, past the platforms, where they can't run clean. "We've waited a long time to answer this. We're not going to waste the answer." The Hive came on. The ring breathed. And below us, in the daylight, the city stood up white and silent into the morning, full of people who did not yet know that the oldest debt this planet carried was about to come due over their heads. For the next hour I did my job, which was to keep Sector 9 breathing while the rest of the ring did things it had never done. The work kept me sane. Every engineer knows this. When the board flashes red, you do not stare at the red, you find the valve. I found valves. The dorsal channels that had lain dry for 40 years were now running near their rated load. And rated load is a phrase you trust on paper and distrust in the flesh, because paper does not creak. The span creaked. It groaned through the gantry struts in long, low notes I felt in my teeth, and I went up and down the bay feeding manual trim to the coolant loops, easing pressure here, opening a bypass there, talking to the structure the way you talk to an old animal you are asking to run one more time. "Easy," I told it. "Easy. You've got this." The Hive crossed the outer marker. I knew because the ledger voice told me and because Caldwell anchor changed. On my board, the platform had been a flat, dark slab, 4 kilometers of patient metal. Now its arrays unfolded. I watched it happen through the viewport, the great panels lifting and rotating along the platform's spine like the wings of something that had been folded asleep for an age, and where there had been smooth, dark plating, there were suddenly throats, hundreds of them, deep recessed barrels that drank the sunlight and did not give it back. The platform did not fire, it simply showed itself. And 41 Hive ships, which had come expecting a soft field and a dead caretaker, sailed straight into the opening eye of it. The Hive pushed another pattern across the bands. This one the translators rendered differently, less inventory, more interrogation. It had noticed the platform. It was asking the ring what the platform was. And underneath the asking I could feel a thing I had not expected from a mind that ancient and that vast. Uncertainty. The Hive had a model of this place, 200,000 years old, and the model was failing, and somewhere in its 41 bodies a recalculation had begun. "They've seen Caldwell," I said. "They've seen one platform," Hale answered. "There are 9. I did not know that. 40 years on the ring, and I had counted the platforms I could see and assumed the rest were stories, like the Hive itself. 9. I sat with the number a moment. 9 slabs of armed metal hung around the equator like beads on a wire I had been polishing my whole life without ever asking what the wire was for. The Hive slowed. For the first time since the lunar shoals, it slowed of its own accord, not on a braking schedule, but with the hesitation of a thing reconsidering. The fibrous trailers that drifted from its hulls drew inward, tightening against the bodies, the way a hand closes when it is no longer reaching but bracing. And then the lead mass did something that the translators struggled with for almost a full minute before they gave me a rendering, and the rendering when it came was 3 words that have stayed in me ever since. "This is wrong," it said. Not a threat, not a demand. A statement of disorientation from a mind that did not, in its whole long memory, have a category for being wrong. The field was supposed to be soft. The caretakers were supposed to surrender. Instead, the field had grown teeth in every direction the Hive looked. And the oldest collective in this arm of the galaxy was discovering, in real time that its model of the universe had a hole in it the size of a planet. Ground command answered then. After an hour of silence, after letting the Hive come all the way in past the shoals and the platforms to the place where it could not run clean, the planet beneath us finally spoke. The reply went out across every band, and the ring let me hear it. It was not a roar. It was not a list of weapons or a recitation of strength. It was a woman's voice, plain and unhurried, speaking in the cadence of someone reading from a record kept faithfully for a very long time. You came to this world once, the voice said. You took what you wanted from a people who could not stop you, and you went away, and you did not think of us again. We thought of you. Every day of every year since, we thought of you. We built against the day you would come back. You have come back. We are still here. There will be no surrender of the field. The Hive did not answer in words. It answered with motion. All 41 hulls began to spread, opening from their tight transit cluster into a wide dispersed front, and from the apertures along their flanks came smaller shapes, hundreds of them, swarming out in clouds, drones, fighters, harvesting craft repurposed for war, I could not tell, only that the sky between us and the Hive was suddenly thick with gray motion. The collective had heard the answer and chosen the old way. It would take by force what it could not take by deed. Here it comes, Hale said softly. I gripped the cradle and watched the cloud come on, and I thought, with the strange clarity that lands on a man in the moments before a thing he cannot undo, that the Hive had made exactly one mistake, and the mistake was very simple. It had assumed that a long absence meant a short memory. It had assumed that because it had forgotten us, we had forgotten it. And every single thing about this ring, this platform, these cities, these 9 beads on the wire, every rivet I had ever torqued and every channel I had ever bled, was the slow, patient evidence that we had not forgotten anything at all. The first weapons fired, not ours, the Hive's. The gray cloud opened up against the span at range, lances of dirty light reaching for the ring, and I felt Sector 11 take a hit 4 kilometers spinward, the structure ringing through the gantry like a struck bell. The board lit with damage, and I was already moving, already rerouting coolant around the wound, already doing the only thing I knew how to do, which was keep the breathing going while the people above my pay grade decided how to answer. Then Caldwell Anchor answered, and I learned what the platform was for. The platform fired once, and a section of the gray cloud simply stopped existing. There was no drama to it. I had braced for thunder, for some great theatrical lash of light, and instead the hundreds of recessed throats along Caldwell's spine pulsed in a single coordinated breath, and where there had been a swarm of hive craft, there was a spreading bloom of vapor and nothing. The platform did not track and hunt individual targets the way a gunner does. It threw a wall. It saturated a wedge of sky with so much directed force that everything inside the wedge ceased to be a problem, and then it shifted the wedge and did it again. I have built and tended machines my whole life, and I had never seen one work with that kind of indifferent efficiency. It was not fighting the swarm, it was deleting it. Sector 11's holding, I reported, because the wound was sealing and the coolant was flowing, and that was my piece of the morning. Channels stable. What are the platforms? Watch your spine, Vorn Hale cut in. They're going for the ring direct now. They figured out the platforms are the harder kill. She was right. The Hive was old and the Hive was wrong about us, but it was not stupid. And a collective mind learns fast when it shares every lesson across 41 bodies at once. It had taken Caldwell's measure in a single salvo and concluded that the platforms were beyond it. So it turned its weight against the softer-looking thing, the long, thin ring with its kilometers of exposed structure, and it threw itself at the span the way a flood throws itself at the lowest part of a wall. This was the part the records had warned about, though I did not know it yet. This was the part we had built the deep channels for. The Hive ships closed on the ring and began to rake it, long sustained lances of fire walking up and down the structure, and the span answered not with guns. The ring carries few guns. It was never meant to be a gun line, but with itself. The dorsal channels I had spent the morning keeping warm reached their true purpose. Across 140 kilometers of structure, the ring began to shed its skin in controlled cascades, vast sheets of ablative plating peeling away on command to swallow the incoming fire and carry the energy down into the deep sinks. And where the plating could not absorb, the ring flexed. It moved. 140 kilometers of armored structure rolled and rippled along its long axis like a serpent turning its scales to a blade, presenting the Hive's lances with hardened edges and sinks instead of soft broadsides, and I sat in the cradle and felt the whole vast body of the thing I had tended for 40 years come alive under me as a single coordinated weapon. I was weeping. I did not notice until later, when the salt dried on my face inside the helmet. I was weeping because I finally understood what my grandfather had built, and his grandfather, and the long line of us back to the rock breakers, and the understanding came with a grief I had no name for. We had not armored our sky out of fear. We had armored it out of memory, out of love, even. Love for the people who would be standing in the white cities below on the morning the debt came due, who would never know how close it came, who would go on with their day while 140 kilometers of patient metal bled and flexed and held the sky shut over their heads. Sector 9, you're taking direct fire, the ledger voice said, flat as ever, and then the world tore. A lance found my stretch of the ring and walked across the gantry I had paced 19 hours before. The hardpoint bay bucked. The board went white, then black, then crawled back to half-life, and through the small viewport I watched the outer plating of my own sector peel away in glowing sheets, sacrificing itself exactly as it had been designed to, exactly as 100 maintenance logs had quietly promised it would. The deep sinks took the energy. The channels I had bled and trimmed all morning carried the heat away into the great cold mass of the structure. The ring held. My sector held. It held because 40 years of an old man with a torque wrench and a bad knee had kept its arteries honest, and in that moment, with the salt on my face and the structure screaming around me, I would not have traded my small, unglamorous life for any other. Voron, report. Hale's voice, ragged now. 9 is holding, I said. My own voice came out steadier than I felt. Plating's gone on the outer face. Sinks are at 60% and climbing. We can take more. Tell Command we can take more. Command knows, she said. Command's been counting on it. Hold on, Sale. The platforms are about to close the door. I did not understand what she meant until the 9 beads on the wire began to move. Before the surrender came, though, the Hive tried one more thing, and it was the most dangerous moment of the whole morning, and almost no one outside the ring ever learned it happened. The collective was old and the collective was trapped, but a mind that distributes itself across 41 bodies does not run out of ideas the way a single commander does. With its swarm deleted and its breakout lane sealed, the Hive did the one thing left to a thing that cannot escape and will not surrender. It went for the throat. It stopped firing at the platforms and the ring's broad faces and concentrated everything it had left onto a single point, the spine junction where the dorsal channels of 3 sectors converged. The place where, if the structure failed, a third of the ring would lose its deep sinks at once and the wall would have a hole in it the swarm could pour through if the swarm had still existed. The Hive could not read our schematics. It did not need to. It had spent the morning being cut by the ring's flexing edges, and a collective learns where a thing is strong by where its own blows do nothing. And by elimination it had found the one place where a blow might do something, and it threw the whole weight of 41 hulls against that single seam. I felt it through the gantry before the board told me. A note in the structure I had never heard in 40 years, a deep wrong groan from spinward, the sound of 140 kilometers of metal being asked to carry a load at one point that the whole length of it was meant to share. The spine junction was 3 sectors from me, but the ring is one body, and when one part of a body screams, the whole body hears it. Spine's taking it all, Hale said, and for the first time that morning her careful voice cracked. Every gun they've got, 1 point. Sinks at the junction are redlining. Voron, they found the seam. Rurut, I said, already moving, already pulling up the deep channel map for the whole spinward third of the ring on my half-dead board. Don't let the junction carry it alone. Spread the load. Open the cross feeds. Pull the heat into 9 and 8 and 7. We'll take their overflow. That'll redline your sinks. My sinks have room. Theirs don't. Do it, Hale. Do it now. She did it. Up and down the spinward third of the ring, engineers like me threw open the cross feeds we had spent our careers keeping closed, and the deep channels that ran the length of the structure opened into one continuous artery, and the killing heat the Hive was pouring into the spine junction spread out along 100 kilometers of sink instead of pooling at one point. My own sinks climbed into the red, and I watched the numbers and did not look away and did not close the feed, because the junction was carrying the whole ring, and the junction did not have the room, and I did. This is the thing about a wall built by a people who remember. It is not strong at one point. It is strong everywhere, on purpose, redundant past all reason, so that when the flood finds the one seam and throws its whole weight at it, the seam is not alone. 100 kilometers of structure carried the blow the Hive meant for one junction, and the junction held, and the wall did not break. The collective felt it fail. I felt the collective feel it. The one idea it had left, the throat blow that should have opened us, had vanished into a body too patient and too redundant to have a throat, and the Hive had nothing after that. It had spent its swarm, spent its weapons, spent its single clever throw against a seam that turned out not to be a seam. There was nothing left to try, and it was then, with the spine holding and the net drawn tight and its last idea gone, that the oldest mind in this arm of the galaxy asked to withdraw, and then, when we said no, offered to surrender. We had not beaten it with a better weapon. We had beaten it with the fact that we had no single place to be beaten, and we had no single place to be beaten because 200,000 years of people had built the wall strong everywhere. For exactly this, for a morning none of them would see. The platforms had never been meant to hold formation around the equator out of habit. They were a net, and the net had been hung loose on purpose, and now it was being drawn tight. I watched it happen on the half-dead board and through the cracked viewport, and I will spend whatever years I have left trying to describe it to people who were not there. 9 slabs of armed metal, each 4 kilometers across, peeled out of their slow equatorial circle and began to maneuver inward toward the volume of sky where the Hive had committed itself. They did not rush. There is no rushing 4 kilometers of mass. They translated, ponderous and certain, closing the distances between them, and as they closed, the wedges of saturated fire each of them threw began to overlap. The Hive had spread itself into a wide dispersed front to attack the ring. That spread was now a trap. Every direction the collective tried to break toward, a platform was already there, already throwing its wall of force across the escape lane, and the volume of clean sky available to the Hive shrank with every minute that passed. The collective understood. I felt it understand. It pushed another pattern across the bands, and this one the translators rendered fast because it was simple. It was the first thing the Hive had said since it arrived that was not a claim or a demand or a statement of disorientation. It was a request to withdraw. They want to leave, I said into the channel. My throat was raw. Hail, they're asking to break off, I know. Are we letting them? The pause that followed was the longest of the whole morning. When Hale answered, her careful voice had gone somewhere very quiet, and I understood that the question had gone up the chain to wherever the real decision lived, to the people who had inherited the longest grudge any species ever carried, and now had to decide in a span of seconds what kind of people 200,000 years of memory had made them. No, Hale said, not yet. Command says hold them. The platforms closed the net the rest of the way. The Hive ships, all 41, were herded into a tightening volume of sky barely larger than the formation itself, every breakout lane sealed by overlapping fire, and the swarm of smaller craft they had thrown against the ring was simply gone, deleted wedge by wedge until nothing gray moved in the space between us but the great pale bodies of the hulls themselves, drawing their fibrous trailers in tight against their flanks like a thing curling around a wound. The Hive stopped firing. There was no point. Every shot it threw at a platform splashed against armor that shrugged it off, and every shot it threw at the ring was swallowed by the deep sink's eye, and 1,000 engineers like me had kept honest for 40 years. The collective had spent its weapons against a wall that did not care, and now it sat trapped in the net of its own arrogance, and it did the one thing 200,000 years of memory had never prepared it to do. It went still, and then it offered surrender. I have thought a great deal since about what the platforms could have done in that moment. They could have closed the net all the way. 9 walls of saturated force converging on 41 trapped hulls. It would have taken less than a minute. Not one Hive ship would have left this system. The thing that came to harvest our world twice would have ended over the white cities of the people came to harvest, and no one in those cities would have known to mourn it. The platforms had the angle. The platforms had the weight. Every instinct of memory and grudge and the long-held breath of 200,000 years pointed at that single clean act of erasure, and I sat in my cradle with the salt drying on my face and waited to watch it happen. It did not happen. Ground command spoke again across the bands. The same plain, unhurried woman's voice, reading from the same faithfully kept record, and what she said was not a sentence of execution. It was a sentence, but of a different kind. You will lower your hulls into our net and you will be taken, the voice said. You will not be harvested, you will not be erased. We are not what you are. We remembered you for 200,000 years and we built our sky against you. And now you will live inside that memory as our guests, and you will learn what it is to be held by a people you came to use. Your ships are ours. Your weight is ours. You surrendered the field the moment you fired on it. Power down and live. The Hive did not power down at once. A mind that has never lost does not know how to stop being itself. For a stretch of minutes that felt much longer, the 41 hulls sat in the closing net and did nothing. And I could feel through the bands the thing the collective was doing, which was the same thing I had done at the start of the morning when the ledger voice first turned flat. It was trying to find the gap. It was running its 200,000-year model of this place against the reality of 9 platforms in a living ring and a planet that had spent the whole interval becoming a wall, and it was searching, with everything it had, for the soft place that was supposed to exist and did not. There was no soft place. We had spent the long quiet making sure of that, and somewhere in its 41 bodies, I think, the collective finally arrived at the bottom of its own arithmetic and found nothing there but us, patient and armed and unforgiving, and yet against all its expectation, not killing it. That was the part it could not solve, not the strength, the mercy. A thing that Harvest does not have a category for being spared by the field. One hull powered down. Its fibrous trailers went slack and drifted. Its apertures dimmed. The swollen gray mass of it went dark and quiet and let itself sink toward the waiting net of the platforms. Then another. Then a cluster of them at once, as the lesson propagated across the collective the way every lesson did, shared instantly through all its bodies. Within the space of a few minutes, all 41 hulls had gone dark, surrendering their weight to the platforms that had trapped them, and the sky between the ring and the hive, which had been thick with fire and gray motion an hour before, went silent and still under the climbing sun. "They're down," Hale said. She let out a breath I felt across the channel. "All of them. They're down. Sail, it's over." It was not over for me. My sector was bleeding heat and I had work to do, and the work is what I remember most clearly from the hours that followed. Not the surrender, not the great pale hulls being drawn in toward the platforms by tugs and tethers, but the slow, ordinary labor of bringing Sector 9 back from the edge. The outer plating of my stretch was gone, peeled away and spent exactly as designed, and the deep sinks were running hot enough that I had to nurse them down by hand, valve by valve, the same way I had nursed this structure for 40 years. I went up and down the bay with my torque wrench and my bad knee, talking to the old animal of the ring, telling it easy, telling it you did it, and it groaned back at me through the struts in those long, low notes, settling, cooling, surviving. At some point, Hale opened a private line, just the two of us, the way old shift partners do when the official channels have gone quiet. "You all right?" she asked. "My sector held," I said, which was not an answer to the question she asked and was the only answer I had. That's not what I asked. I looked out through the cracked viewport at the earth below, at the white cities standing up into the morning light, full of people walking to work, opening shops, putting children on transports, none of them knowing that the oldest debt their world carried had just been called and paid over their heads. None of them would ever know my name. None of them would know Hale's, or the name of the woman whose plain voice had read mercy to a thing that came to harvest us. That was the point. That was the whole shape of the thing we had built and tended and bled for. The people below were supposed to go on with their day. The not knowing was the gift. "My grandfather laid scaffold on this ring," I said finally. "His grandfather broke rock for the anchor cities. None of them knew what they were building for. They built it because the ones before them said, build it heavy, build it to last, never let it go cold. And I spent 40 years thinking I was a man who fixed valves. I had to stop. The grief I had no name for was very close. 40 years, Hale. And the one morning it mattered, all I did was keep the channels honest." "That's all any of us did," she said quietly. "That's the whole job. You keep it honest for 40 years so that on the one morning it matters, it holds. The people who built this knew they'd be dead before the day came. They built it anyway. You tended it anyway." A pause. "That's not a small life, Sale. That's the largest kind there is." I did not answer her. I did not trust my voice. I went back to my valves. They needed engineers on the hulls, and that was how a man who fixed valves ended up standing inside the thing that had come to harvest the world. I did not volunteer out of courage. I volunteered because the call went out for structural specialists who could read unfamiliar architecture under load, and 40 years of reading the span's arteries had made me, without my ever intending it, one of the few people alive who could look at a strange pressurized structure and know whether it was about to fail. The captured hulls were not stable. They were grown things, not built ones, and grown things do not have schematics. Command wanted people aboard who could tell, by the groan of a bulkhead and the weep of a seal, whether a powered-down Hive ship was going to hold or come apart and take a boarding crew with it. I had spent my life listening to metal complain. I went. The shuttle ride out to the nearest captured hull took 40 minutes, and I spent most of it looking at the thing through the port as we approached. Up close, the scale of it stopped my breath. The hull was easily a kilometer along its long axis, swollen and pale and pocked, and the fibrous trailers that had drifted from its flanks in the fight now hung slack and dead, vast as forest canopies, drifting in the platform's tether field. We had been told the collective was disarmed and dormant, its bodies powered down and its mind drawn back into some core we did not yet understand. We had not been told what it would feel like to drift up against the flank of something that ancient and that wrong and put a docking collar on it. It felt like trespass. It felt like laying hands on the inside of a tomb that was not as empty as the records had promised. We went in through an aperture the platform crews had cut and pressurized, and the inside of the Hive ship was the strangest country I have ever walked. There were no decks. There were no corridors in any sense I knew. The interior was a single continuous grown space, vaulted and ribbed, the walls slick with a substance that was neither metal nor flesh, but something Between, faintly warm even with the ship dead, faintly luminous where our lamps were not. It did not smell, through the suit, but the suit's sensors told me the air the Hive had breathed was thick and strange and old, and that some of the molecules in it had no entry in any catalog we carried. We moved in a line, 6 of us, structural specialists and a pair of contact officers whose job I did not envy, and we went deeper into the swollen quiet of the thing, reading its bulkheads, listening to it settle, mapping a body that had no map. It's load-bearing in tension, not compression, I said, mostly to myself, running a gloved hand along a rib the thickness of a tree trunk. The whole hull's held together like a web. Pull any major strut and it doesn't crack, it unravels. That's why the ring's lances cut it so clean. We weren't punching holes. We were cutting threads. Is it going to hold while we're in here? One of the contact officers asked. For now, I said. It's a web with the tension off. It'll sag, it won't fall. But I want eyes on the major junctions. If one of those lets go, I did not finish. They understood. We found the bodies an hour in. I had braced for it, the way you brace for a thing you have been told is coming, and the bracing did not help. Deep in the central vault, in chambers grown like the cells of a hive in truth, the Hive's living forms hung dormant in their thousands, not crew, not soldiers in any rank I could read, but components, each one a node of the collective, dark-bodied and many-limbed and folded in on itself in the powered-down sleep the platforms had imposed. They were not dead. The sensors found tick of life in everyone. They were simply held, exactly as the woman's voice had promised, taken, not harvested, alive inside the memory of a people they had come to use. There were so many of them that the lamps could not find the ends of the chambers, and I stood among them in the warm, luminous dark and understood for the first time that the 41 hulls were not 41 ships. They were one creature, vast and distributed and asleep, and we had not defeated an enemy fleet. We had caught a god in a net and decided, for reasons it could not comprehend, not to kill it. The collective's core was awake. They had told us it was drawn back and dormant, and they were wrong, and I was the one who found out. I was reading a junction near the heart of the central vault, a place where 6 of the great ribs converged into a knotted mass the size of a house, when my suit's sensors began to behave the way the span's ledger voice had behaved at the very start of the morning. Flat, insistent, reporting something my instruments could measure and my mind did not want to accept. There was a field around the knot, a structured field, ordered, recursive, the unmistakable signature of something thinking. The platforms had powered down the bodies. They had not reached the thing the bodies were nodes of. The core of the collective hung in the knotted heart of its own ship, dimmed and trapped and unable to move its 41 bodies, but awake and aware, and I understood this slowly. The way you understand bad news, watching me. I've got an active field at the central junction, I said into the channel, keeping my voice level. Something's still on in here. Something big. The contact officers came up fast. One of them carried a translation rig, a heavier cousin of the one the ring used, and she set it against the knotted mass and let it listen, and for a long moment the only sound was my own breath and the slow warm settling of the dead web around us. Then the rig spoke. It rendered the core's thought into our language the way the ring had rendered the Hive's hails, imperfect and strange, and what it rendered was not a demand and not a claim and not this time even disorientation. It was a question, and the question was for me. The core had felt me reading its body. It had felt my hands on its ribs and known me for what I was, the way one craftsman knows another, and across the gulf of 200,000 years and 2 incompatible kinds of mind, it asked me the only thing it could not work out on its own. Why, the rig rendered, did you not finish? I stood in the warm, luminous dark, with my hand still on the rib of the thing that had come to harvest my world, and I understood that the question was sincere. The collective was not pleading. It did not know how to plead. The records were right about that much. It was simply confused, at the deepest level a mind can be confused, by an outcome its model could not produce. It had come to a soft field and found a wall. It had fought the wall and lost. By every law it understood, the wall should now erase it. Because that is what the strong do to the weak when the weak are caught. The collective had done exactly that to us, twice, 200,000 years apart, without a flicker of doubt. And instead the wall had caught it gently and was keeping it alive, and the keeping made no sense, and the senselessness was the only thing in the universe that frightened it. The contact officers looked at me, because the question had been asked of me, and the translation rig was waiting, and someone had to answer. I am not a diplomat. I have never been good with words. I am better with valves. But I had spent the whole morning weeping inside my helmet over a thing I had finally understood about my own people, and the understanding was still raw in me, and so I told the truth as plainly as I knew how, and let the rig carry it back into the strange old mind in the dark. Because we remembered being you, I said. I waited for the rig to render it, and then I went on, because the core was still listening and the words were coming now, slow and certain. 200,000 years ago you came here and you took what you wanted, and you did it because you were strong and we were soft and you had no reason not to. We were the field then. We know exactly what it is to be the field. We spent every year since building so that no one could ever do to us again what you did. And the whole time we were building, we made one promise, and we wrote it down, and we kept it across more generations than you can count. The promise was that when we were finally strong, we would not become you. We would not harvest. We would not erase. We would remember what it was to be small, and we would not do to the next small thing what was done to us. I stopped. My voice had gone rough. That is why we did not finish. Not because we are weak. Because we decided a long time ago what kind of strong we were going to be. You taught us that the first time you came. The rig went quiet. The core went quiet. And in the warm, dark heart of the thing that had come to use us, something vast and old and finally, fully aware, sat with an answer it had no category for, and could not refute, and would carry now inside the memory of a people it had come to harvest, for as long as we chose to keep it. I should have felt triumph going back to the ring. What I felt was the count. The shuttle carried us back across the stilled sky, past the captured hulls hanging dark in the platform tethers, and the contact officer who had run the translation rig sat across from me and read off her board in a low, flat voice the thing nobody on the bands had said out loud yet. We had not come through clean. The Hive had walked its lances up and down 140 kilometers of ring before the net closed, and where the plating had peeled and the sinks had taken the load, the ring had held. But holding is not the same as untouched. Sector 11, 4 kilometers spinward of mine, had taken the first hit of the morning and a worse one near the end, and the hardpoint bay there had not held the way mine did. The people in it had been doing exactly what I had been doing, feeding manual trim to the channels, keeping the breathing honest, and the structure around them had finally given where it had been hit twice, and they had not come back. I had known them. Not well. You do not know everyone on 140 kilometers of ring. But I had stood with the lead engineer of 11 in a dock canteen more than once, an unhurried woman named Tessa Marin, who had been on the span almost as long as I had, who fixed valves the way I fixed valves, who had a granddaughter she talked about and a bad shoulder she would not have looked at. She had kept her sector honest for 30-some years so that on the one morning it mattered it would hold. And on the one morning it mattered it had held long enough, and then it had not held, and she had been inside it. The contact officer finished reading and put her board down, and neither of us said anything for a while. This is the part the stories leave out. The men who tell these tales later make the victory clean because a clean victory is easier to carry. But there is no clean victory over a thing that fires on you. The ring held. The cities below never knew. The Hive surrendered and lived. And Tessa Marin, who had spent her life keeping her sector honest, was gone along with the rest of the 11 hardpoint crew, and no plain unhurried voice reading mercy from a record was going to bring them back. The promise we kept that morning, the promise not to become the thing that harvested us, was not free. It was paid for by people who held a wounded structure together with their hands a few minutes longer than the structure wanted to be held, so that the ones above their pay grade had the time to close a net instead of firing a wall. Was it worth it? The contact officer asked. Not to me exactly, more to the port and the stilled sky beyond it, sparing them, costing us that, to spare them. I thought about the core in the warm dark, asking me why we did not finish. I thought about Tessa Marin's granddaughter, who would grow up in a white city that never knew the debt had come due, who would never be told the name of the woman who held the sky shut a few minutes longer than it wanted to be held. Worth isn't the word, I said finally. We didn't spare them because it was worth it. We spared them because of who we decided to be, a long time before any of us were born. The cost doesn't change the decision. It just means the decision was real. I looked at her. A promise you only keep when it's free isn't a promise. It's a preference. We made a promise. This is what keeping it costs. She did not answer. There was nothing to answer. We rode the rest of the way back to the ring in silence, and below us, the earth turned blue and patient under the climbing sun, full of people who would never know what the morning had cost or who had paid it, and that not knowing, I told myself again, was the whole shape of the gift. The record the woman's voice had read from was real, and in the weeks that followed I was given leave to see it, and seeing it changed how I understood everything I had ever touched. I had assumed, the way most of us assumed, that the deep history was lost. 200,000 years is not a span any archive should survive. Civilizations fall in a few thousand. Languages die in a few hundred. And yet the woman's voice had read the first harvest as if from a page plainly, without strain, the way you read a thing your people have never once let go of. And I wanted to understand how that was possible. They let me into one of the Anchor City archives. a structure built into the bedrock, under one of the white mountain ranges of towers, and there I learned the second half of what my people had spent the long quiet doing. We had not only built the ring and the platforms, we had built the memory. The archive was not paper, and it was not data in any form that could simply rot. It was carved. Deep galleries of it, kilometers of it, the record of the first harvest cut into stone and metal and stranger media in 100 redundant copies across the planet and the moon and the forward posts, rewritten and recut and recarried by every generation as a sacred obligation, the way my grandfather's people had recarried the scaffold and the anchor cities. The story was simple, and it was terrible. A collective had come to a soft young world and used it, taken its metals, its biomass, its people, not out of malice but out of the same flat appetite a flood has, and then gone away and forgotten, exactly as a flood forgets. The world it left behind had nearly died of it. A handful had survived in the cold and the ruin, and the handful had made the promise that became the spine of everything that followed. We will remember this, and we will become strong enough that it can never happen again, and when we are strong enough, we will not become the thing that did it to us. 200,000 years. The promise had been kept through ice ages and dark ages, and the slow grinding rebuild of a species from almost nothing. Every generation had inherited two obligations and discharged both: build the wall higher and keep the memory whole. Not one generation had broken the chain. Not one had decided the threat was too old to bother with, the grudge too ancient to maintain, the wall too expensive to keep cold and ready for an enemy that might never come. They kept it cold and ready anyway. They kept it ready for 200,000 years for a single morning that most of them must have privately doubted would ever arrive. And the morning arrived, and the wall held, and the memory had a name to put to the thing that came, because we had never once let go of it. I stood in the carved gallery under the white city and ran my hand along the cut record the way I had run my hand along the rib of the Hive ship, and I understood finally and completely what kind of people I came from. Not clever, not lucky, not gifted with some last-second genius. Patient. Patient past all reason. Patient past the death of everyone who began the work and everyone who would finish it. Patient enough to hand a grudge and a wall and a promise down through more years than the human mind can hold, and to keep all three honest the whole way down. The Hive had counted on us forgetting because forgetting is what minds do. It did not understand that we had made the not forgetting into the central act of our civilization. We were the field, once. We decided we would never be the field again, and then we did the unimaginably patient work of meaning it. That was the win. Not the platforms. Not the ring. The platforms and the ring were only what the promise looked like when you built it out of metal. The win was the 200,000 years of people who never let the memory go cold, so that when the harvest finally circled back to the field remembered its name and was ready. There was one more thing the archive taught me, and it was the thing that has stayed with me longest, longer even than the morning itself. The carved galleries did not only record the first harvest, they recorded the doubt. I had expected the deep record to be a monument, all resolve and certainty, the kind of clean, heroic memory a people carves when they want to feel strong. It was not that. Cut into the stone, alongside the account of the harvest and the promise that followed it, were the arguments, every generation's arguments, about whether to keep going. I read them in the gallery under the white city, and they undid me, because they were not the words of confident people. They were the words of tired ones. Every few thousand years, it seemed, some generation had stood where I had stood and asked the question that any reasonable person eventually asks: how long do we keep this up? The threat was ancient. It might never come. The wall cost more than anyone could easily say, in labor and in lives and in the simple weight of organizing a whole civilization around a grudge older than its languages. Was it not madness? Some of them had asked, carving the very question into the record so it would not be lost, to spend everything on readiness for a morning that the odds said would never arrive, and every generation had answered the same way, and carved the answer next to the question, and gone back to building. They answered that the cost of being ready and never needing it was a cost you paid in labor and in patience, and the cost of needing it and not being ready was a cost you paid in extinction, and that no honest accounting of those two costs could ever make readiness the foolish choice, however long the wait, however certain the doubt. They answered that the Hive had counted on exactly this, on some weary generation deciding the grudge was too old to keep, and that the whole strategy of a thing that harvests and circles back is to outlast the memory of the harvested, to come home after the field has gotten tired of remembering. They answered, generation after generation, that they would not be the ones who got tired. And then they handed the wall and the memory and the doubt itself down to the next generation, doubt and all, because a people who pretend they never doubted are a people who will break the first time doubt arrives, and a people who carve their doubt into the stone beside their resolve are a people who have already survived it. I came up out of that gallery a different man than I went in. I had thought before that my people's strength was the ring and the platforms and the patient, overwhelming power of a civilization that had spent 200,000 years arming its sky. That was real, but it was not the strength. The strength was that they had been tired and doubtful and reasonable and had wanted to stop. Every generation of them had wanted to stop, and not one of them had. The wall was not built by people who found it easy. It was built by people who found it hard, every single year, for 200,000 years, and built it anyway. That is a thing the Hive will never understand if we hold it until the stars burn out. A flood does not get tired. A flood does not doubt. Only a thing that was once small and wronged and is now strong and weary, and keeps the promise through the weariness, ever has to choose. We chose. 200,000 years of us chose, against the doubt carved right there in the stone beside the choosing, and the morning came, and the wall held, because the ones before us were tired and did it anyway. Not everyone agreed with the mercy. I want to put that in the record too, because the stories that leave out the cost also leave out the argument, and the argument was real. In the weeks after the surrender, while the captured hulls hung dark in the platform tethers, and the contact teams worked to understand the core, a question went up and down the ring and the cities and the chain of command that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with who we were going to be now that the morning had come and gone. The question was simple. We had a god in a net. We had the thing that harvested our world twice, alive and disarmed and entirely at our mercy. What did we do with it? There were people, good people, not cruel ones, who said we finished it. They said the promise to spare the small thing did not extend to the thing that was never small, the thing that had erased our ancestors without a flicker and would do it again the moment our backs were turned. They said mercy to a flood is not mercy, it is an invitation for the flood to return. They said Tessa Marin and the 11 crew were dead because we had hesitated, and that every future generation we left exposed by sparing the Hive was a debt we had no right to incur on their behalf. I heard the argument in the dock canteens, and I could not call it wrong. I had stood among the thousands of dormant bodies in the warm dark. I knew exactly what we were choosing to keep alive. And there were people who said we did not finish it, and these were not the soft ones, though the first group called them soft. These were the keepers of the carved galleries, the ones whose whole obligation was the memory, and they made the argument I had made to the core without knowing it was the argument the memory itself made. They said the entire point of 200,000 years was that we became strong enough to choose, and a choice you only make one way is not a choice. They said if we erase the Hive now in cold blood in a net, then the harvest had won after all, not by taking our world, but by making us into the thing that took it. They said the promise was never that we would be safe. The promise was that we would not become what was done to us. And keeping that promise meant keeping the Hive alive even though it cost us, even though it frightened us, even though a simpler people would have closed the net and slept easier. The decision, when it came down the chain in the same plain, unhurried cadence the woman's voice had used to read mercy to the Hive in the first place. We would not finish it. We would hold it. The collective would remain disarmed and dormant in its bodies, its core awake and contained, its ships ours, its weight ours, and over time, on our terms and at our pace, we would teach it the thing it had no category for. We would show it the carved galleries. We would show it what it had done and what we had chosen not to do in return. We would keep it as a guest and a prisoner and a student, a flood caught in a net and held until it understood, for as long as that took, even if that took another 200,000 years. We had been patient that long once. We could be patient that long again. I think that was the moment I stopped being afraid of my own people's strength and started to understand it. Strength that only knows how to erase is not strength. It is just appetite with better tools. It is the Hive, exactly. The Hive was strong. The Hive had always been strong. And the Hive had spent its whole long existence as a flat, unchanging appetite because strength had never once cost it anything, never once made it choose. We had paid for our strength with 200,000 years of memory and a hardpoint crew on Sector 11, and the paying had made us into something the Hive could not be, a power that could hold its own hand. That was the difference the core could not solve. That was the thing it would spend the rest of its long captivity learning, if it could learn at all. I went back to the hull one more time, months later, and the core remembered me. By then the captured ships had been moved into a slow-holding orbit out past the platforms, tethered and monitored and slowly understood, and the contact teams had built a kind of routine with the collective that nobody a year before would have believed possible. The bodies stayed dormant, the core stayed awake. And between the core and the carved galleries the contact teams had opened a channel, narrow and strange, through which the oldest mind in this arm of the galaxy was being shown, patiently and without cruelty, the record of what it had done and the choice we had made not to answer it in kind. I do not know how much a thing like that can change. I am an engineer. I distrust any claim of transformation I cannot measure on a gauge. But I asked to go aboard one more time, because the question the Corps had asked me in the warm dark had stayed in me, and I wanted to know whether the answer I gave it had landed anywhere. They let me aboard. The interior was the same warm, luminous country, the same web held in slack tension, the same thousands of dormant bodies folded in the dark. I went to the knotted heart with a contact officer and the heavier translation rig, and I put my hand on the rib where I had put it before, and I waited. The Corps knew me. The rig caught the shape its attention, turning toward me the way a face turns when a familiar step crosses a room. It did not ask why we had not finished. It had been months inside the carved record. It knew now the shape of the answer, if not yet its weight. Instead, it offered something the rig struggled with for a long time before it found the words. And the words, when they came, were not a surrender and not a thanks, because the collective still did not have those categories. They were closer to a measurement. The Corps had been running its model again, the 200,000-year model of the soft field, and it had finally finished rebuilding it around the hole. And what it gave me was the new model's single central finding. You became the thing, the rig rendered, that we could not. I did not understand it first. The officer beside me did, and explained it later, but in the moment the Corps went on, slow and certain, and the rig carried it across, and I understood it myself by the end. The collective had spent its entire existence as the strongest thing it ever met. It had never been the field. It had never been small, never been used, never had to remember a wrong across the death of everyone who suffered it, never had to choose between erasing an enemy and becoming one. It had no memory because it had never needed one. Nothing had ever been done to it that it would have wanted to remember, and so it had stayed exactly what it was, for longer than our whole species had existed, strong, unchanging, incapable of the one act that requires being hurt first and choosing mercy anyway. We had been hurt. We had remembered. We had grown strong and then declined on purpose at cost to use that strength the way it had been used on us. And that decline on purpose, that holding of our own hand, was a thing the Corps could see clearly now and knew, with the flat honesty of a mind that does not lie to itself, that it could never have done. We had become the thing the harvest could not become. The field had grown into something stronger than the flood, and then had refused to flood. I stood there with my hand on the rib of the thing that had come to use my world, and I felt the grief again, the old nameless grief that had been with me since the morning, and this time I had a name for it. It was the grief of being shown, plainly and at last, exactly what my people had paid to become, and how long they had paid it, and how few of them had ever known it would matter. Tessa Marin had not known. My grandfather had not known. The rock breakers who laid the first anchor cities had carved the promise into stone for a morning they would never see, and they had been right to, and they were all gone, and the only thanks any of them would ever get was a planet full of people walking to work under a white sky that never knew. Thank you, I said, to the Corps, though it had no category for that either, for coming back, so they could find out it was worth it. The rig did not render my words. Some things do not translate. I took my hand off the rib and I went home to the ring. There was a small thing that happened on the ride back from the hull that last time, and I have never told anyone, and I will set it down here, because it belongs in the record more than half the grander things do. The shuttle passed close by Caldwell Anchor on the way in, and the platform had its arrays folded down again, flat and dark and patient, 4 kilometers of metal sleeping in the daylight as if it had never woken at all. A year before, those folded panels had lifted and shown their hundreds of throats and deleted a swarm wedge by wedge, and now they lay flush against the spine as though the morning had been a thing the platform dreamed. I asked the pilot to hold us a moment, and she did, and I looked at the slab of it through the port for a long while. I had passed Caldwell 1,000 times in 40 years and barely looked. I had thought it was scenery. I had thought the ring was the work, and the platforms were just the heavy, quiet things that hung around it, the way a man thinks his own house is the world, and the mountains behind it are only a view. Now I knew what the platform was for, and I could not stop looking at it, and what struck me was not its power, it was its stillness. The platform had done the most violent thing I ever witnessed, and then folded itself back down and gone quiet, asking nothing, claiming nothing, taking no posture of victory. It had thrown a wall of force that ended hundreds of the Hive's bodies, and then it had simply stopped, because the job was done, and there was no more job. And a thing built by people who remember does not gloat over the work. It sleeps until it is needed again. It is patient the way the people who built it were patient. Beautiful, isn't it? The pilot said, following my eyes. I thought about it. The platform was not beautiful the way the white cities were beautiful, or the way the curve of the earth was beautiful in the dawn. It was beautiful the way a kept promise is beautiful, which is to say it was beautiful only if you knew what it had cost and what it had refused to do with its strength. To anyone who did not know the morning, it was just a dark slab in the sky. To me, it was the whole of my people in one shape, strong enough to erase, patient enough to wait, disciplined enough to fold back down and go quiet when the killing was done, and merciful enough, in the end, to catch the flood in a net instead of drowning it. Yes, I told the pilot, it is. I never went back to the hulls after that. There was nothing more the Corps needed from me, and nothing more I needed from it. I had asked my question and given my answer, and heard the strange measured thing it said in return, that we had become what it could not, and that was enough. I went home to the ring, to the valves and the channels and the slow honest work, and I left the oldest mind in this arm of the galaxy to its long captivity and its longer education, learning at the pace of stone what my people had spent 200,000 years deciding to be. The ring did not stop needing valves because a god had been caught in a net. That was the first thing that surprised me about the after. I had half expected the world to change shape around the morning, the way a man expects the ground to look different after an earthquake. It did not. I came back to Sector 9 and the outer plating was still gone, peeled away and spent, and the deep sinks were still running hotter than they should. And the channels I had bled all morning still needed bleeding, and so I picked up my torque wrench and my bad knee and went back to work, and the work was exactly the same as it had been the day before the contacts crossed the lunar shoals. There is a mercy in that too. The structure does not care that it held the sky shut. It cares that its arteries are honest, so I made them honest, valve by valve, the way I had for 40 years, and the ordinariness of it was the closest thing to healing I found. Rebuilding the outer plating took the better part of a year. New ablative had to be grown and shaped and fitted across the stretches the Hive had, peeled, mine and the others up and down the ring, and I worked those crews because I knew the underlying structure better than anyone left alive on. 9. We did not just replace what had been spent, we improved it. Every engineer who had read the morning's damage had learned something about where the ring strained under real load, and the lessons went into the new plating the way every generation's lessons had gone into the ring since my grandfather's grandfather broke the first rock. The wall got higher, not because we expected the Hive to break free, though we did not entirely rule it out, because that is simply what we do. We were the field once. We have not stopped building since, and we will not stop, because the promise was never that one morning would settle the account. The promise was that we would always be ready, and always being ready is not a state you achieve. It is a thing you do every day, with a torque wrench and a bad knee, until you hand it down. The hardest part was Sector 11. They asked me to take it. Tessa Marin's stretch needed a lead engineer who could rebuild it from the structure, up, hardpoint and all, and the people above my pay grade decided the man who held 9 through the morning was the man to do it. I did not want it. I told them I did not want it. Rebuilding the bay where Tessa and her crew had died, knowing exactly how the structure had given and exactly what it had given onto, felt like a thing I did not have the room in me to carry. They let me say no for a week. Then I went and walked 11 myself, alone with a lamp, through the scarred and silent stretch where the Hive had walked its lances twice. And I stood in the ruined hardpoint bay where Tessa had fed manual trim to her channels a few minutes longer than the structure wanted to hold, and I understood that there was no one else who should do it. You do not hand the worst stretch of the wall to a stranger. You give it to someone who knew the woman who died holding it. I took 11. I rebuilt 11 over the next 2 years, and somewhere in the rebuilding the granddaughter found me. Her name was Iola Marin, and she was 19, and she came up to the ring on a transport one ordinary morning and asked the dockmaster where she could find the engineer who had taken her, grandmother's sector. She had been a child when Tessa died, too young to be told the real shape of the morning, and she had grown up in one of the white cities below, knowing only that her grandmother had worked on the orbital ring and had not come home from maintenance accident. That was the official record. A structural failure during routine work. It was not a lie, exactly. It was the not knowing we had decided to give the people below, the gift of an ordinary grief, instead of the unbearable knowledge that the oldest, dead of their species, had come due over their heads and their grandmother had helped pay it. She had come up to see the place. That was all she wanted, she said. To see the stretch of the ring her grandmother had kept honest for 30 years. She did not know what she was asking. I almost gave her the official record and sent her home with her ordinary grief intact, the way we had decided to do for everyone below. I had my hand on that decision the way you have your hand on a valve. And then she looked out through the viewport at the curve of the earth and the white city standing up into the morning light, And she said, very quietly, that she hoped her grandmother had not died for nothing, that she hoped it had at least been something that mattered, and I found that I could not send her home with the lie, so I told her. Not all of it. Some of it was not mine to tell. But I told her that the morning had not been an accident. I told her that something had come back to this world after a span of years she could not hold in her hand, expecting to take it the way it had taken it once before, and that the ring her grandmother kept honest had held the sky shut while the world below went on with its day, and that her grandmother had held her own stretch of that wall a few minutes longer than it wanted to be held, so that the people above her pay grade had the time to choose mercy instead of slaughter. I told her that Tessa Marin had died keeping a promise 200,000 years old, a promise that we would become strong and not become cruel, and that the promise had been kept, and that the keeping had a cost, and that her grandmother was the cost, and that there was no version of the morning where the cost was not real, and no version where it was not worth paying. She did not cry, which surprised me. She stood very still and looked at the white cities for a long time, and then she asked me the only question that mattered, the question her grandmother would have asked, the question the whole long line of us had been answering with our hands for 200,000 years. Can I learn it? She said. The work. Keeping the channels honest. Can I learn to do what she did? I looked at this 19-year-old girl standing in the bay where her grandmother had died, asking to take up the same torque wrench and the same bad mornings and the same near certainty that the day it all mattered would not come in. Her lifetime either. And I understood that I was watching the chain hand itself down in front of me, exactly as it had handed itself down to me, and to Tessa, and to my grandfather, and to the rockbreakers before any of us. Nobody made Iola Marin ask that. The hive was caught. The wall had held. By every reasonable measure, the threat that had defined our whole civilization was sitting disarmed in a holding orbit, and a sensible girl would have gone back down to a white city and lived an ordinary life under a sky someone else kept ready. She asked to keep it ready instead. That is the thing the hive will never understand if we hold it for another 200,000 years. Strength can be inherited. Patience that long has to be chosen, every generation, by someone young enough to know the day may never come and old enough to keep the wall ready anyway. Yes, I told her, I can teach you. It's mostly valves. I taught her the way I had been taught, which is to say slowly and with my hands, and she was better at it than I had been at her age. Iola Marin had her grandmother's ear for metal. I do not know how to explain that to someone who has not done the work. There is a thing the structure tells you, a complaint it makes before it fails. A change in the note a strut sings under load that means the load is finding a path it should not take, and most people never hear it at all. Tessa had heard it. Her granddaughter heard it. Within a year, she could walk a stretch of the gantry and tell me, before any gauge confirmed it, that a coolant junction 4 spans down was going to start weeping by the end of the shift. And she was right more often than she was wrong. I had spent 40 years learning to hear what she heard inside of one. The work was in her the way it had been in her grandmother, the way it had been in my grandfather, handed down not as knowledge but as something closer to instinct, the accumulated patience of a people who had been keeping metal honest for longer than they could remember. I told her everything I knew. I told her where 11 strained and where 9 ran hot, and which of the old valves you could trust on paper, and which you had to trust with your hands. I told her about the deep channels and what they were truly for, and I walked her through the morning, beat by beat, the contacts crossing the lunar shoals and the platform unfolding its eye, and the net drawing tight and the plain unhurried voice reading mercy to its flood. I held nothing back because the not knowing was a gift we gave the people below, and Iola Marin had chosen to come up out of the white cities and stand on the wall, and the wall keeps no secrets from the ones who hold it. She needed to know exactly what she was keeping ready, and why, and what it had already cost, and what it might cost her. She did not flinch from any of it. That was her grandmother in her too. The years went by the way they do on the ring, in shifts and repairs and the slow, ordinary labor of keeping 140 kilometers of structure breathing. The hive stayed in its holding orbit, dormant and contained, its core still being shown the carved galleries by the contact teams, changing or not changing in ways no gauge of mine could measure. The platforms folded their arrays back down and resumed their patient circle. The cities below went on, white and silent, full of people walking to work under a sky they never thought about, which was exactly as it should be. And I got old. My bad knee got worse. The 40 years became 43, then 45, and the day came the way it comes for every engineer, when I knew I had more shifts behind me than I had ahead, and that the wall would need to be handed down whether I felt ready to hand it or not. I was not afraid of that. A man who has spent his life on a structure built by the dead for the unborn makes his peace with being one more link in a chain that does not stop for him. What I felt in those last years on the ring was something quieter and harder to say. I had been given the one thing almost none of my line ever got. The rock breakers built the anchor cities for a morning they never saw. My grandfather laid scaffold for a morning he never saw. Tessa Marin kept her sector honest for a morning she saw for only a few minutes before it killed her. And I, a man who fixed valves, who had thought for 40 years that he was nothing more than that, I had been standing on the wall on the one morning in 200,000 years when the thing the wall was built for finally came, and I had felt it hold, and I had learned why. Almost no one in the whole long chain ever got to find out it was worth it. I found out. I do not know what I did to deserve that, and I have stopped asking. I only know I was there, and it held, and I got to see the promise kept with my own eyes. And that is more than any of the ones before me ever got, and I am grateful for it in a way I will never have the words for. I handed 11 to Iola Marin on an ordinary morning with no ceremony, because the wall does not run on ceremony, and neither do the people who keep it. I walked her stretch with her one last time as the lead engineer, and then I walked it again as something else, a man who used to hold it, and I gave her the manual override codes and the deep channel keys and the long list of the sector's small honest secrets that live in no log and pass only from one pair of hands to the next. She took them the way she took everything, quietly, with her grandmother's still attention, and when we were done, she stood at the viewport of the rebuilt Hardpoint Bay and looked out at the curve of the earth the way she had looked at it the first morning she came up when she still thought her grandmother had died in an accident. "Do you think it'll come again?" she asked. "Something. In my time." It was the question, the one every keeper of the wall has asked the one before them, all the way back to the rock breakers. I had asked it once of the man who taught me, and he had given me an answer I did not understand for 40 years. And now I understood it well enough to pass it down. "Probably not," I said. "Probably you'll spend your whole life keeping a sky shut against a thing that never comes, and you'll get old doing it, and you'll hand it to someone else, and they'll do the same. That's the most likely shape of it. The morning came once for me. It may not come again for 100 generations." I looked at her, "and you'll keep it ready anyway. Every shift, every valve. The same as if it were coming tomorrow. Because the day you keep it ready badly, on the assumption that the morning won't come in your time, is the day it comes." She nodded slowly. She understood. Her grandmother's ear, her grandmother's stillness, and now the thing behind both of them, the patience that is not inherited but chosen, the willingness to spend a whole life keeping a promise that may never once be called. I left the ring not long after. They offered me a place in one of the white cities, a quiet retirement under the sky I'd spent my life keeping shut, and I took it, and I live there now, an old man with a bad knee in a tower full of people who do not know what the wall above them cost or who paid it. I do not tell them. The not knowing is the gift. I have said that already, and I have come to believe it more, not less, with the years. They walk to work. They open their shops. They put their children on the transports. Above them the ring turns, 140 kilometers of patient metal kept honest by a woman with her grandmother's ear, and beyond the ring the platforms circle, and beyond the platforms, in a slow holding orbit, the oldest mind in this arm of the galaxy sits caught in a net it has had centuries to understand, and still cannot fully solve, learning at the pace of stone what it is to be held by a people it came to use. Sometimes on clear days, I go up to the high terraces of the city and look at the sky, and if the light is right I can see the ring as a thin bright line across the blue, and I think about the whole long chain of us, the rock breakers and my grandfather and Tessa Marin and the plain unhurried voice that read mercy, from a record kept faithfully for 200,000 years. We were the field once. Something came and used us and forgot us and circled back expecting the field to be there still, soft and waiting, and it found instead that the field had spent the entire interval becoming a wall, and the wall remembered its name, and the wall was ready, and the wall, this is the part I want said plainly, because it is the part that matters, and the part the Hive will spend forever failing to understand. The wall could have erased the thing that came and chose not to, and that choice cost us, and we paid it, and we would pay it again. That is what we built up there, not a weapon. A promise made by people who were small and wronged, kept by people who became strong and did not let it make them cruel, handed down hand to hand across more years than the mind can hold, until the morning it was called. They came back expecting to find us finished. They found us still here, and still keeping the promise, and that was the thing they could not survive. Not our strength, which they understood, but our memory, which they never could. We remembered. We were ready. And when they finally came home, they came home too late to find a world that had forgotten how to be the field.